Welcome back to Unbreakable Alliances, the podcast, where we explore how to build trust-based relationships that transform your life. I'm Dreeke, retired FBI agent and behavioral analyst, sharing my insights from my book, Unbreakable Alliances. So far, we've covered allies, trust, communication, and conflict in episodes 1 through 5. Today, episode 6 dives into chapter 6, context, the recipe for acceptance and understanding. Understanding others' perspectives is key to strong alliances, and I'm excited to answer your questions about it today. So let's get started. All right, so let's get started with a big one. Robin, why is understanding context so important for alliances, and how did I use it in the FBI? That is a big one. I was on a podcast the other day, and the host asked me a really interesting question. What was the major event in my life that kind of shifted that ability to understand the context of others? Like many things in life, there wasn't one critical event necessarily. It's a series of reps of aha moments, humbling moments. And when it came to understanding context, and I've mentioned this already on one of the episodes, my supervisor asking me, so why should that individual want to be recruited by you? It forced me to reverse that context. Our job was to recruit Russian spies, that I was supposed to come up with some slick, perfect one-liner or what I call carnival tricks to cajole someone to join my team. That crap is garbage. The stuff you see on TV, on James Bond or any of these shows that says it's all about manipulation and subterfuge and what I want fail in real life. And so that's what I was learning. And so having my supervisor forcing me to reverse that context was a major moment. But also being on my behavioral team was. Because not just in my own cases, but when I was on my team as a team member, and you're traveling all over the country, interacting with case agents all over the country, doing what I call righteous work of trying to inspire individuals to cooperate to protect the national security of the United States, our friends, our family, our allies, the world. It was a really big eye-opener because on every single operation, especially my earlier ones, when I was in a massive learning mode, like hopefully we are every day, I was a team member, not the team leader. And I remember we had a team leader, very, very good seasoned agent. He wound up running the team before I did, and I took over when he retired. He was really good at asking this question every time. So we're going into a case assessment. We're listening to the case agent, talk about the case, talk about the people involved in the case, talk about management, talking about the individuals they want to have the interaction with and that they're trying to recruit. And please notice, I keep using the word individuals they plan on interacting with. I'm not talking in terms of subjects. I'm not talking in terms of targets of investigations. I'm not talking in terms of manipulation tools or vulnerabilities of people, because remember, those are words that objectify a human being and demean them in our mind. And that leakage of how we feel towards someone can come out. So that's part of this context thing, right? But he would always ask that really important question on every single assessment that kept me thinking and getting the reps without even realizing it. I didn't even realize, like most of us don't, that we're absorbing these life skills along the path that we're walking until we have time to sit and reflect back on what made me who I am today, what makes me effective today, what makes me not effective today. Those are those aha moments. And so this is the question he asked every single assessment. And that was, is the case agent that we're speaking to the right person to do this operation? Is this person the type of person that can let go of their own personal bias, how they feel about this individual who they might not like, who they think might be an abhorrent human being? Are they the right person to do the interaction? Because if they felt any of those emotions, then they're not the right person to do that interaction. So part of our assessment for the case agent to be successful, for the FBI to be successful, ultimately for the nation to be successful, we always had to ask, was the individual doing the operation the right person? In other words, did they understand the context of the individual they're wanting to interact with? And when you understand the context, their ethnicity, their generation, their demographic, the miles and miles they walked to get to where they are, to who they are, to make the choices they're making in their lives, without judging it. If you are that person, then you are the right person to do the interaction. If you are judging that in some way, if you find them abhorrent, if you find them distasteful, then they're not the right person to do that interaction, because that leakage about them will come out. Nowhere along this line of understanding the context of others do I say you have to agree with them. Did I say you have to like them? Did I say that you align with their morals, ethics, and choices that they made in life? It's not about that. It's just understanding from their point of view why they made those choices. So you can do the most important thing in the world when you're trying to build a connection and get cooperation, build a partnership to move forward to a common objective, identifying a common objective together, and that is that non-judgmental, active curiosity, which is understanding their context. It rings through absolutely everything. I have interviewed some of the most interesting people in the world, and I use that word interesting because before I did this for 22 years with the FBI, I would have said a different word than interesting. I find people interesting now. Before I would have said these are nutbags, they're jerks, they're idiots, they're morons. I would use all those judgmental words because I was sitting in judgment, because if you weren't rolling like me, you must be wrong. If you didn't have the same understanding of the world through my optic and lens, through all my experiences, you must be wrong. And so when I finally let go of that, and when you discover the need to let go of that, the path starts to truly begin. How did I discover that path? That was simple. I failed. My job was to see what I could do to make a connection and understand the individual. I thought my job was not just to recruit Russian intelligence officers, but part of that was I had to hate them. I had to dislike them. But what I found is when I started doing a deep dive, and I remember this, the first intelligence officer I tried recruiting, I found through my investigation, through my observations and my sources, that he actually had a very nice family back in Moscow. He had 2 kids and 2 daughters of his own that were here with him. His paycheck he was getting was supporting an elderly mother that was still alive back in Moscow that was having a very hard time. And when you start looking at that life through his lens, you start understanding, wow, what could I do to approach this human being in a productive way to lower their shields, to see if I can be a resource for those critical life issues they have. And it's okay if they say no, because would I say yes? And if I didn't want to say yes in that moment, what might inspire me to say yes? And because I took such a deep dive on understanding the context of all the people I ever had as people that were assigned to me to try to recruit, I remember every single one of them. I remember their family stories. And it's interesting about that too. None of them probably even know who I was, because I didn't have an opportunity to make that offer because of rules, process, regulations, procedures. But I knew them so deeply for who they were. I was doing all I could to see what I could do to be a resource for them if they made that choice to try to do something like cooperate with me to take care of their family. It's really interesting. Because of that, I gained deep reps and a lot of reps in understanding the context of others, and it was profound. All right, so here's a fun one I like. Robin, how does embracing differences strengthen alliances, and can I share an example? So it's so much fun when you get a question and you think about it and all the different things that pop in your mind that you hadn't thought about in a while, and this is one of them. So probably the most interesting people I met during my FBI career, believe it or not, wasn't the spies necessarily, the Russian intelligence officers or the Chinese intelligence officers we were trying to recruit, or any myriad of intelligence officers around the world. They all kind of blend together in a sense of they're all highly educated, working on behalf of their governments, and their backgrounds are pretty similar. They all went through their advanced training. They're highly skilled linguists. They're very smart. They had good family and stable backgrounds in general, because in order to serve overseas at an embassy or at a diplomatic establishment, they had to have a really solid background. So they all kind of blend together. I found them to be really, really good human beings, just working for a different country. So it was easy to see the context through that one. But the ones that I found the most interesting, that I learned the most from about context and making these connections, was when a conflict in the world broke out. Typically, in the world of counterintelligence, our responsibility in the FBI is to interview everyone we can that we're aware of from that country that's here in the United States, to try to gain intelligence, ground truth, not only protect the national security of the United States and provide information to policymakers, but also protect them if they're going to be targeted by individuals and organizations internal to the United States that don't like them. So it's always about making relationships with people everywhere. And so I remember when the Iraq war broke out right after 9/11, we were interviewing a lot of people from the Middle East and from Iraq, and New York City. You can find the most unbelievable people in New York City. And I remember one of the interviews we did, it was so interesting because we wound up finding Saddam Hussein's dentist, his former dentist that was actually living in New York City, or I think it was one of the suburbs. This individual was so fascinating because when you start out that question with an individual, it's like, what was that spark and inspiration that inspired the path that you walked to become the dentist for Saddam Hussein? Oh my gosh, what a journey he took us on. And here is what was even more interesting, where you had to understand and not judge the context of everyone involved in this individual's life. First of all, this guy was one of the friendliest, nicest individuals I've ever met in my entire life. He opened his home. He was very accommodating, because here we are, two FBI guys, myself, and in my book, his name's Jesse Thorne, is my partner in crime. In life, as you know, his name was John. We knocked on this guy's door, totally unannounced, and said, hey, my name's Robin, it's my friend John, we work FBI counterintelligence in New York City, and we're hoping to have a conversation with you about your background, your experiences, and see if there's anything you might be able to share with us that might be beneficial to not just yourself, but our country, and also to safety and security and prosperity for people in your own country. It's kind of a typical thing I say. Again, make it all about him, talk in terms of things that might be important to him, like his safety, security, and prosperity for himself and those he cares about, just like mine. And he was so accommodating, invited us in, offered us tea, and we couldn't get him to be quiet. He was telling us all about his life, his background, telling about working for Saddam Hussein, telling about Saddam Hussein's likes and dislikes, his interests. I mean, this is fascinating stuff. But then his wife comes in, and his wife was not a fan of the U.S. government, and she was starting to rant and rave. She wanted to kick us out of the house. And we're like, okay, we'll leave. This is totally your choice. And so we're getting up to leave. He then keeps pulling us back in because he's like, oh, I just want to keep talking to him. I want to keep talking to him. His wife says, no, I don't like them. So finally, she acquiesced to her husband and sat down and chatted with us, because we're just so open to understanding everyone's background, their context. And so we asked her a lot about her and how she got into her advocacy for ACLU and the rights of human beings. And like, funny, we were all in that same business. So I just found it a really interesting experience, just him amongst hundreds of others, because everyone's got this unique background and context. And when you let go of your own and can embrace theirs, boy, you can make some deep connections and make some great allies. Alrighty, moving right along. I often get asked, Robin, how do you overcome communication barriers and alliances? Let's take a look at communication barriers that are based upon language differences. I don't speak another language, and yet I was tasked with recruiting confidential human sources and intelligence officers from other countries. It was really important to meet them where they're at. It wasn't thinking in terms of the 2-hour or 4-hour class I had on their culture that I did not want to impose what I learned about you on you. Now, when it comes to the language and the words themselves, slow down, be patient, seek clarity on every single point on which you're speaking before you move on. You'll be amazed. I remember there was this operation I had. Again, I was recruiting a Russian intelligence officer, and I had a wire on, so I was being recorded so we could listen to it playback later. And this gentleman that I was trying to recruit, he was a Russian military intelligence officer, so he was actually from the military as well, even though he's from Russia. English was his second language. And during our conversation we were having over a meal together, which was being recorded, where I'm moving him down towards that recruitment angle, and he didn't know who I was. I was an undercover capacity. And I remember after the meeting lasted like 2 or 3 hours. And a great conversation. We talked about his future, talked about other employment opportunities that I have contacts might be able to help him with on the side. All the things you do during a slow developmental to empower him with choice. Talk in terms of his priorities, let him know what resources I had in terms of those priorities, and then display the behaviors of trust, which is open, honest communication, transparency, and vulnerability, besides the fact that I was acting in undercover capacity. But moving him down that road. And I remember after the meeting, the plan was to meet up with my team, my FBI team, to debrief me on what I remembered from that meeting. And then we'd get the transcription of my wire I was wearing so we could actually listen to the audio. I remember going to the meeting right afterwards and them asking me, how was his English? And I said, oh, his English was great. We communicated perfectly. And then we listened to the audio. And the audio was a fascinating study because he would start a sentence and start struggling with words he was trying to find. But because in the moment, in his presence, I was watching his nonverbal behavior and I was able to fill in words for him. And as he would start struggling, I'd say this word. And he goes, yes, that's it. And then we move on to the next one. That happened throughout the 2 or 3 hours. And so it was about 2/3 of him speaking and 1/3 of me helping him find the word he was looking for. So his English wasn't as good as I thought it was because I was helping him with his English. It was a really fascinating study of communicating together when you actually had all the other indicators of words, language, and intention coming through nonverbally. Because they do say, as you all have probably heard, nonverbal behavior, nonverbal language is 85% of communication. No kidding. If you ever sit down with someone who English is not their first language and struggling with it as a second language, and you're face to face with common purpose, you have good trust, good rapport, you'll be amazed about the gaps you can fill in when you're doing that. So, as always, pay attention, keep it slow, meet them where they're at, see the world through their optic, their context, and work together for that mutual understanding. Here's another one that's really important, and these are all threading together as you're seeing already, and that is, Robin, how can curiosity help us understand others' context? Well, as we know with the keys of communication, non-judgmental active curiosity is the third bedrock of the keys of communication. So curiosity is really everything. That non-judgmental active curiosity, which is being curious about what someone else wants to share, not necessarily what you want to know. And when you can align them, that's fine. But remember, we want to be curious about what other people share because that is their context of what's most important. So that's what we really want to focus on. Just my last couple years in the FBI, I was interviewing and working with a lot of clear defense contractors in my area where I live in Virginia. We probably have 300 or 400 of them. A lot of these companies are being targeted by nefarious foreign actors and individuals like China, Iran, Russia, all these people that don't have the best interests of the United States at heart. China especially with clear defense contractors. I remember, if you go into a company, I mean, just think about this. Do your own little thought experiments as I'm kind of playing this out for you. I had friends of mine that were other agents. They would walk into a company where they set up a meeting or just arrived in the front door, and they would start out a typical conversation, as everyone's probably seen on the news, like, hey, China is really eating our lunch and taking advantage of companies just like yours, and here I am as a resource from the FBI to help you work your counterintelligence and discover any insider threats and help protect you and your proprietary information from what the Chinese are trying to do to you. Okay. Now think to yourself, what if you don't believe that as a company? What if you haven't experienced that? What if you actually have documented, well-regarded Chinese employees that are actually not working on behalf of the Chinese government? That statement I made, as benign as you think it is, it might not be the context of the individuals you're speaking with, and it could be very off-putting, even though your delivery is beautiful as well. And so remember, honoring the keys of communication and using curiosity as a theme here, take the same intent of what you want to do, and that is you're seeking the cooperation of this company against a potential threat coming from China. So instead of walking in the front door and imposing on them what you think, just reverse it. As you walk in, as you meet and greet, and you start some rapport, say, hey, it's very nice to meet you. My name is Robin Dreeke. I happen to work counterintelligence here in the local office of the FBI. I work with a lot of clear defense contractors, and we're seeing a trend from time to time that your companies are being targeted by nefarious foreign actors. And I'm curious, has that ever been your experience? So now I'm seeking a thought and their opinion. And I'm getting some feedback from them, whether that's actually their context and experience or not. And after I get that feedback and experience, I can then have active curiosity and go down some of those roads if they've had that experience. And even if they haven't had that experience, I can then share, oh, thank you very much for sharing that. I really appreciate that. One of the trends we're also seeing from some of the other cleared contractors is that China has been going after them against some of their proprietary information. I'm curious, what do you think about China? And is that something that you've been seeing? Now I'm seeking that thought and opinion. I'm laying down some context from what other people are saying, using a little bit of social proof, not saying what they should do or what they shouldn't do. I'm seeking that thought and opinion, seeking that context, all by being actively curious. Now, here's the great thing. If they say no, that hasn't been our experience, I say, I appreciate your feedback very well. If you want, please be on the lookout for it. And if I can ever be a resource for you in that area or any area whatsoever, please let me know. Here's my card. Here's my information. And also, I don't want to inflict myself anywhere where I'm not wanted. If you also would prefer not to speak to me ever, also please let me know, and I'll completely leave you alone and make a note in my file to, hey, they have no need of working with the FBI. That entire conversation was all about them. And that last part where you're empowering people with choice, people that are insecure have a hard time doing that. I can tell you, every time I empowered someone with choice about saying, hey, if you want me to leave you alone, I'll make a note and leave you alone, no one has ever said, go away and leave me alone. Why? I inspired them to feel safe with me because they had a choice of whether to allow me into their lives or not. So that is the power of curiosity and discovering context. I absolutely love this one because I actually got this one, the idea and concept of it, from my good friend Joe Navarro, who wrote about this in the book Be Exceptional, because this is one of the traits of exceptional people, and that is they create psychological safety with those around them. So here's the question. Robin, how can we create psychological safety in alliances? Everything we've been talking about so far, everything is about creating that psychological safety for a human being, because the opposite, the dichotomy of psychological safety, is the greatest motivator of human beings, and that is fear. When we fear something, we will take actions to not fear it. Because remember, we want to feel safe, secure, and prosperous for ourselves and those we care about in our lives. If we don't do those things, it's because we have fear. And so fear is the opposite of psychological safety. So how do we create psychological safety? Well, we honor the 4 keys of communication. We seek their thoughts and opinions instead of pontificating about our own. We talk in terms of their challenges, their priorities, their pain points instead of ours. We're non-judgmentally actively curious about them. And here's the big one for encouraging and inspiring psychological safety. We empower people with choice. There's a term that I learned, and I've said it a few times here, and that is situational awareness. When I was in the Marine Corps, my job inside the Marine Corps, it's called a military occupational specialty, is I was what's called an air support control officer. That job is, in layman's terms, like combat air traffic control. My job was to direct aircraft that was coming off the aircraft carrier or an amphibious assault vehicle or anywhere in the area of operations of Marines on the ground and coordinate their support of Marines on the ground, whether it's dropping bombs, whether it's resupply, whether it's medevacs, and all these things. In order to do that, as a senior air director in our control center, I had about 15 other Marines that were all talking to ground units, to air units, to everyone in the area of operation. And on one ear, I had all those radio nets dialed up. I had like 15 at one time, sometimes on my left ear, and on my right ear, I had it open so I could hear everything going on my team. And it was really interesting because as it was described to me, and you learn through reps and through the training we had, and granted, I was 23 years old doing this, 24, it was all about situational awareness. Because when I was situationally aware, I could make choices to keep people safe. And so what you're doing is when you're empowering people with choice, they feel safe because you're being transparent, you're being open, you're being honest. And when you are having vulnerability, showing them what your challenges and weaknesses are as well as your strengths, you're giving them clarity of their own area of operation, and that empowerment of choice allows them to feel safe because with that situational awareness, they can now make choices that'll allow them to feel that psychological safety. And You accomplish that because you're open, honest with that communication, you're transparent, you're vulnerable. Those are the behaviors of trust, because trust inspires a feeling of safety, security, prosperity. Here's one of the behaviors that inspires us to feel safe is consistency. And that's what I talk about when I talk about trust. Trust is repeatable behaviors we're able to see over a period of time, so I can predict what you're going to do. Because when I can predict and create a routine and understanding of what I can reasonably expect from you in every kind of situation, I can now trust you. And because I can trust you to do X, Y, and Z a certain way, I can feel safe in my own choices of what to do, engaging with you, engaging with the world around you. But if you're all over the place because you're erratic, because you get emotionally hijacked, because you don't know what to do when the fog of war hits and things get chaotic, that does not inspire one to feel safe. That makes them feel fearful because they do not know what to expect. They do not know how to make a decision for themselves, for their own psychological safety, prosperity, and for themselves and those they care about. So we want to be consistent with those around us. We need to be open. We need to be vulnerable. Again, it keeps coming back to the same core principles we've been talking about the entire time. So how do you create psychological safety? Inspire someone to feel safe by being open, honest with your communication, transparent and vulnerable, and empowering them with choice about how to move forward. Here's one that took me a long time in my life to finally understand how to do, but it is simple to say, challenging to execute because our ego and our biology gets in the way sometimes, and it's this. Robin, how does being present help understand context, and what's the story from my FBI days? Well, first, let's talk about what being present means. We hear this all the time, don't we? Just be present, be organic, be genuine, be sincere. What do all those things actually mean? What do they look like to the other person? So let's start with just being present, because I think everything springs from that. Being present is engaging another human being or the situation free of an agenda. I think it's that simple, and here's why. What happens when we engage a human being or situation in life? We engage, we hear something, we see something, and what immediately happens is that our brains start trying to identify patterns. We want to start identifying patterns because patterns become predictability. Predictability inspires us to feel safe, because remember what we just talked about is that feeling of safety is being predictable with the environment around us. And so when we start jumping in with trying to identify patterns, whether they're accurate or not, that's what we're going to do. And so we now start thinking about what's in our head. We stop observing what's actually around us as much because we're trying to identify and match these patterns. Same thing when someone starts speaking to us. When someone starts speaking, share an anecdote, a story, or context, what normally starts happening is we start thinking in terms of, oh, I have a like story, I have something similar to happen to me, and we want to start injecting that, referring to that, or even just thinking about that. And as soon as we start thinking about the story that popped in our own head or the response that we want to say from listening to the other person, we're no longer 100% focused on them, and we're no longer completely present because we're thinking somewhere out here. We're thinking in here. We just draw back in. So that's why I say, once you engage someone or someplace and you can be present, be there, see, hear everything, free of an agenda, and to your utmost ability, free of a confirmation bias of what you're trying to see, what you're trying to observe. Because as soon as you start trying to see something, we talked about this when talking about trying to discover whether someone's trying to deceive us or not, if we're looking for lie detectors. Because if we're trying to find someone that's lying, we're going to miss everything that they're saying truthful, because we gave ourselves a negative confirmation bias. If we're trying to see what's wrong in our environment, we're going to miss everything that's right in the environment. And so that's what I mean by being present. Be here. Be in the now. You've done all the great research. You've done all the great things it is that you want to know. It's all in the back of your mind. But if you can just be present, free of what it is you're trying to achieve and your own goals and objectives and priorities, so you can hear, observe, and listen to everything in your environment, including what someone's saying, that is what I'm talking about. Because when you can be present, you're going to start getting actively curious about filling out all the little nooks and crannies about what the other person's saying, so you can start growing your own visual picture from the other person's point of view. because that's what context is. Seeing the world through someone else's point of view. Brene Brown wrote about this in one of her books. I thought this was a really great analogy and way to think about this. You don't have to just walk in someone else's shoes to discover context. First, you have to take yours off. What's that actually mean? You got to let go of you in order to see the world from that point of view. You can see the arc of everything we've been talking about in all these episodes so far is like how to do that deep reversal, that deep context in order to create great active alliances, because it's all about understanding others, not agreeing with them. You can if you want, if it actually aligns with you, but it's just that deep, deep understanding. And so in order to do that, you have to have presence. All right, last one, final question. I love it. Here we go. Robin, what's a common mistake in understanding others' context and how do we avoid it? Common mistake is really assumptions. If we assume we know the context of the other person and just dive right in, communicating in terms of what we think they are and how we think they want to communicate, and make assumptions about their challenges, priorities, and pain points, and what they see as safety, security, and prosperity from their perspective, if we're assuming we know that and we actually don't, that's the mistake. And this is why we often have engagements and relationships at work and at home, in our personal lives and professional lives, that are success, failure, success, failure, success, failure. Because most of us guess at the context of others, and we're guessing about how to engage. And that's why if we're guessing right on one, it goes really, really well. We guess incorrectly on another, and it falls completely flat or even gets ruined. Because we didn't give the most important gift of all times, which we mentioned earlier, the gift of presence. Free of an agenda, engage openly with that non-judgmental active curiosity to discover that context, so you don't have to make assumptions about what that context is, so you can now take the core content of the information that you're hoping to exchange, you package it just for them in a way that they're inspired to want to receive it, and then you can start that great communication. Because when you cascade that with the behaviors of trust, which is that open, honest communication, the transparency, and the vulnerability, we start moving down the road of a great collaborative, unbreakable alliance. And so avoid assumptions at all costs so you can actually understand exactly what their context is. Alrighty, folks, that is it for episode 6. We've explored understanding context today, from embracing diversity to fostering psychological safety. I hope you're inspired to connect more deeply in your alliances. Next time in episode 7, we're going to dive into chapter 7, Build, focusing on long-term alliances. Subscribe, drop your questions in the comments below, and visit me at robindreeke.com to keep this conversation going. Thanks for joining me, and as always, stay safe and keep charging hard.